The 1980s were a time of bold fashion, new music, and unforgettable food. From the pub counter to the family dinner table, Britain was tucking into dishes that now feel like a time capsule of the decade. Some were hearty classics, others were experiments that captured the spirit of the age, but all of them defined how we ate in the 80s. In this video, we're serving up 15 iconic British foods from that unforgettable decade. If even one of these brings back a memory, make sure to subscribe, and let's dig in. If there was one dish that screamed sophistication in 1980s Britain, it was the quiche, and the queen of them all was Quiche Lorraine, a golden pastry crust filled with eggs, cream, cheese, and smoky bacon. It was a slice of French chic that made its way onto British tables in style. By the 80s, quiche wasn't just food, it was a statement. Dinner parties featured it as the centerpiece, served with salad and a glass of wine. Supermarkets began selling ready-made versions, making what once felt continental suddenly accessible to every household. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Some joked about it being too posh or foreign, and in later years, it even became a cultural punchline. But in the moment, Quiche Lorraine captured the mood of a Briton experimenting with new tastes and looking beyond traditional fare. Today, it's still around, but few dishes evoke the 1980s middle-class dinner table quite like a quiche cooling on the counter. Few starters say 1980s Britain quite like the prawn cocktail, served in a glass dish with layers of lettuce, tiny pink prawns, and that creamy Marie Rose sauce. It was the opening act at countless dinner parties and pub meals. It had actually gained popularity in the 70s, but the 80s turned it into a true icon. Restaurants across the country put it on their menus, and home cooks proudly presented it as a sign of being up to date with the latest food trends. It was exotic enough to feel exciting, yet familiar enough to please everyone. Part of its charm was the theater of it. The glassware, the little wedge of lemon perched on top, and the sprinkle of paprika for a final flourish. For many Brits, this was the first taste of seafood sophistication. Today, you might see prawn cocktail as retro kitsch, but back then, it was pure glamour. Nothing started a meal in the 1980s quite like that first forkful of prawns coated in tangy pink sauce. In the 1980s, Britain still loved its puddings, and none felt more traditional than Spotted Dick with custard. Despite the name always raising a giggle, it was a true comfort food, a sweet sponge speckled with dried fruit, spots, and served piping hot with a generous pour of custard. It was the kind of dessert that brought families together at the dinner table, especially on Sundays. School canteens also kept it alive, dishing out thick slices drowned in bright yellow custard that stuck to the roof of your mouth. For many children, it was both a treat and a ritual. You couldn't imagine a proper meal without something warm and sweet to finish it off. In the 80s, when frozen desserts and packet mixes were becoming trendy, Spotted Dick stood as a reminder of Britain's love for hearty, old-fashioned puddings. Today, it's less common on menus, but for anyone who grew up in the 1980s, the memory of that soft sponge and custard combo is impossible to forget. If you went to a party in the 1980s Britain, chances are you saw a plate of vol au vents. These little puff pastry cases, light and flaky, were filled with everything from creamy mushrooms to coronation chicken, and they screamed sophistication. They were bite-sized, dainty, and just exotic enough to impress guests. Hosts loved them because they looked fancy without being too difficult to make, especially as supermarkets began selling ready-to-fill versions. You'd see them lined up on buffet tables next to bowls of crisps and sausage rolls, a marker that this was no ordinary gathering. In some homes, They became a staple of Christmas and New Year's Eve parties, their glossy, golden pastry shining under the tinsel and fairy lights. For many, the memory of pinching one off a tray while dodging adults with sherry glasses is tied directly to growing up in the 80s. Though they've since fallen out of fashion, few foods sum up the decade's love of stylish finger food quite like the humble vol au vent. By the 1980s, Britain was falling in love with curry, and nothing captured that new passion better than chicken tikka masala. Tender pieces of spiced chicken simmered in a rich, creamy orange sauce. It was mild enough for cautious eaters, yet exotic enough to feel adventurous. Many pubs and restaurants proudly served it, and it quickly became the safe choice for anyone ordering Indian food for the first time. Supermarkets started selling jars of tikka masala sauce, making it easy for families to recreate the dish at home, even if the result never quite matched a proper curry house. There's still debate about whether chicken tikka masala was born in Glasgow or adapted from Indian recipes. But by the 80s, it was already on its way to becoming Britain's unofficial national dish. For many who grew up in that decade, memories of sharing a tikka masala on a Friday night with rice, naan, and maybe a pint on the side are as much a part of the 80s as the music and fashion. In the 1980s, if you really wanted to impress your guests, you served beef Wellington. This show-stopping dish wrapped tender beef fillet in pâté and mushrooms, all encased in golden puff pastry. A masterpiece when done right. It wasn't an everyday meal. Beef Wellington was for special occasions, Christmas dinners, anniversaries, or that dinner party where you wanted to prove you'd mastered fine dining. Cookbooks of the era treated it like the height of culinary sophistication, and TV chefs demonstrated it with the seriousness of a royal recipe. For many home cooks, it was a challenge. Tricky to get the beef perfectly cooked without burning the pastry. But pulling it off meant applause at the table and a sense of triumph. In Britain of the 80s, when food was becoming as much about presentation as taste, beef Wellington stood as the ultimate centerpiece. Even now, just the name carries a whiff of glamour, tied forever to the decade when dinner parties mattered almost as much as the food itself. While the 1980s brought plenty of flashy new dishes, some old favorites never left the table, and shepherd's pie was one of them. Made with minced lamb, vegetables, and topped with a thick layer of creamy mashed potato, it was the kind of comfort food families relied on week after week. In many homes, it was the ultimate budget-friendly dinner. Leftover meat could be stretched with carrots, peas, and gravy, while the mash gave it that hearty, filling finish. Every cook had their own little twist. Extra Worcestershire sauce, a sprinkling of cheese on top, or even baked beans mixed in. It was also a dish children grew up with. For kids in the 80s, nothing felt more like home than a bubbling shepherd's pie coming out of the oven on a cold evening. Even as Britain experimented with more international flavors, this humble classic stayed put, anchoring the menu with warmth and tradition. In a decade of change, shepherd's pie was a taste of continuity. If there was ever a dish that summed up British simplicity in the 1980s, it was beans on toast. Quick, cheap, and endlessly comforting, it was the go-to meal for students, busy parents, and anyone looking for something warm and filling without fuss. The magic was in its versatility. Some liked it plain, just a tin of Heinz beans poured over buttered toast. Others dressed it up with grated cheese, a fried egg, or even a splash of Worcestershire sauce. Whatever the version, it was ready in minutes and always satisfying. For children, beans on toast often meant tea time in front of the telly, cartoons on the screen, and orange-stained fingers from mopping up the sauce. For adults, it was a lifesaver after a late shift or a night out. It wasn't glamorous, but it didn't need to be. In the Britain of the 80s, beans on toast was proof that sometimes the simplest things leave the strongest memories. In the 1980s, no pub menu felt complete without Scampi and Chips. Golden, breaded morsels of langoustine, or sometimes less glamorous substitutes, served alongside a heap of thick-cut chips and a wedge of lemon, became a true staple of the decade. It was the perfect middle ground, a step up from plain fish and chips, yet not too fancy to put people off. Families ordered it on seaside holidays, couples chose it for a Friday night out, and pubs proudly advertised it as part of their plated meals. For many, the memory isn't just the taste, it's the setting. Sticky pub carpets, a pint of lager or a baby cham on the side, and that little ramekin of tartare sauce waiting to be dipped into. Scampi and Chips spoke of a Britain that was discovering a taste for variety, while still holding on to its love of deep-fried comfort. And even today, just seeing it on a menu is enough to transport many straight back to a pub meal in the 1980s. Few dishes in the 1980s, Britain were as thrifty and filling as corned beef hash, made from tinned corned beef, potatoes, and onions, all fried together into a crispy, golden mix. It was the kind of meal that stretched the family budget, but still felt satisfying. In many homes, tins of corned beef were a pantry essential, affordable, long-lasting, and always there when you needed a quick dinner. Some families added baked beans, others topped it with a fried egg, letting the yolk run into the hash for extra richness. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. Working-class families across Britain relied on it, and for children of the decade, the smell of corned beef frying in the pan was as familiar as the sound of the evening news. Today, it's rarer to see corned beef hash on the table, but in the 80s, it was part of everyday life. Proof that comfort often comes from the simplest combinations. For families in the 1980s, Britain, few dinners were as beloved, or as fun to say, as toad in the hole. Despite the odd name, it had nothing to do with toads. It was sausages baked in a fluffy Yorkshire pudding batter, rising high in the oven and crisping at the edges. This was proper comfort food, cheap, filling, and perfect for feeding a hungry family. Gravy was a must, poured generously over the sausages and batter, often with peas or carrots on the side. Every home cook had their own way of making it. Some packed it with onions, others added mustard for a little kick. For children, watching it puff up in the oven was half the fun, as if the dish itself was alive. And once it hit the table, there were rarely leftovers. In the Britain of the 80s, when families often gathered around the table for hearty meals, toad in the hole was a reliable favorite. Warm, filling, and unforgettable. If you went to school in the 1980s Britain, chances are you remember jam Roly-Poly, this old-fashioned sweat pudding rolled up with sticky jam inside, was a staple of school dinners and family kitchens alike. It wasn't fancy, but it was hearty. Served in thick slices and always drowned in hot custard, it was the kind of dessert that warmed you up on a cold day and stuck to your ribs. For many kids, it came after plates of mince, mash, and overcooked veg in the school canteen, a sweet reward for getting through the rest. Homemade versions appeared on dinner tables too, often with raspberry or strawberry jam, sometimes even treacle for extra sweetness. The texture was dense, slightly chewy, and utterly comforting. For a whole generation, the sight of that jam swirl under a glossy layer of custard is enough to spark instant nostalgia. In the 1980s, jam Roly-Poly wasn't just dessert. It was the taste of childhood. If jam Roly-Poly was the classic school dessert, Treacle sponge pudding was its rich and sticky cousin, steamed to perfection and served with a flood of custard. It was one of those puddings that defined British comfort food in the 1980s. The sponge itself was light yet indulgent, soaked with golden syrup that oozed down the sides as soon as you cut into it. The sweetness could be overwhelming, but that was exactly the point. It was a treat meant to brighten up even the dullest winter day. School canteens, family kitchens, and even restaurants kept it on the menu because everyone knew it would be a hit. For many children, the sight of treacle sponge being wheeled out on a trolley was enough to cause a ripple of excitement in the dining hall. It wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. In the Britain of the 80s, treacle sponge pudding was proof that the simplest recipes could deliver the biggest smiles. In the 1980s, Britain started to look east for culinary inspiration, and nothing summed up that shift quite like the Beansprout Stir-Fry. Supermarkets began stocking stir-fry packs and bottles of soy sauce, and suddenly families across the UK were experimenting with Chinese-style dinners at home. Bean sprouts were at the heart of it, crunchy, cheap, and endlessly versatile. Tossed in a hot pan with onions, peppers, maybe a splash of soy and a dash of ginger, they became the symbol of quick, modern cooking. For many Brits, this was their first taste of Asian-inspired food. It felt exotic without being intimidating, and it fitted neatly into the new trend for lighter, healthier meals. You'd find stir-fries on pub menus too, often served with rice or noodles, showing just how quickly they'd gone mainstream. Looking back, Beansprout stir-fries were simple and sometimes a little bland. But in the 80s, they represented something bigger, a Britain discovering global flavors and bringing them into everyday life. In the 1980s, when pubs were reinventing themselves as places for hearty meals as well as pints, the Ploughman's lunch made a strong comeback. A simple spread of crusty bread, sharp cheddar, pickled onions, and chutney, sometimes with ham or apple slices on the side. It was rustic food with timeless appeal. The beauty of the Ploughman's was its simplicity. No cooking required, just good ingredients arranged on a wooden board or a big plate. It felt traditional and wholesome, harking back to an idealized countryside Britain, even if you were eating it in a busy city pub. In the 80s, it was marketed as a return to roots, honest food for honest people. Paired with a pint of bitter, it became a pub classic, perfect for long summer afternoons or quick weekday lunches. For many, the taste of strong cheddar with tangy pickle is inseparable from memories of pub gardens, dartboards, and laughter echoing off low-beamed ceilings. The Ploughman's lunch wasn't just a meal, it was a slice of British identity rediscovered in the 1980s.